Good evening, anarchists everywhere, and welcome to Anarchism in the UK. I'm Ian Bone. I've been an anarchist since 1963, and all that time I can't recall there ever being a radio or TV programme on anarchism. So we aim to set that right over the next 6 weeks, when I'll be interviewing 6 anarchists about different eras of anarchist history in the UK. Tonight we'll be exploring the most notorious episode in anarchist history in this country, the Siege of Sidney Street in 1911, and finding the truth out at last about that mysterious man they call Peter the Painter. I'm joined by Phil Ruff, who's been an anarchist since 1972, on the editorial board of Anarchy magazine, Black Flag magazine, and worked for Cienfuegos Press. Phil has been at work since 1986 on his projected book, provisionally entitled The Life and Times of Peter the Painter. Welcome, Phil.
Good evening, Ian.
Could you give us a quick beginner's guide to the Siege of Sidney Street and the Houndsditch murders?
Yes, the Houndsditch murders, which happened on the 16th of December 1910, were still today the single most worst police murder in British history. A group of Latvian anarchists who were trying to tunnel through the wall of an adjacent building into a jeweller's shop were interrupted by a group of City of London policemen and opened fire, hitting 5 of them and killing 3. The only clues to the identity of the culprits was that one of the gang, who was accidentally wounded in the affray, was later found abandoned and dead in the East End flat of 2 Latvians known as Fritz Svars and Peter the Painter. On the 2nd of January 1911, Svars and his accomplice Sokolov were betrayed to the police by a former landlord, Charles Perlman, and besieged by 750 armed police and soldiers. The initial intention of the police was to ambush and kill the 2 fugitives, and to that purpose they'd drawn up 2 furniture vans full of armed police to attack the anarchists as they left the building. However, overcome by boredom, one of the police ambled up to the front of the building and threw pebbles against the window to attract the attention of the people inside, whereupon a fusillade of shots from inside erupted through the window and wounding the policeman and starting the siege, which lasted for 7 hours and was only concluded with the deaths of the 2 fugitives. It included a company of Scots Guards from the Tower of London, directed by the Home Secretary Winston Churchill, and even artillery field pieces were summoned to shell the anarchists into submission, although they arrived too late to take part in the battle.
Probably been an investigation by the police complaints authority today. 2 sort of side things always interested me about the Siege of Sidney Street was that the 2 anarchists in there, their guns, which were like handguns, seemed to outshoot the Metropolitan Police and the Scots Guards. How was that?
Well, the anarchists in Sidney Street were armed with 3 weapons, 2 C96 Mauser broom-handled pistols and a Browning 7.65mm pistol. The broom-handled Mauser had an effective range of 1,000 yards and could penetrate masonry. If you fitted the wooden stock to it, became a carbine. Could be switched to full automatic, which made it a machine carbine, and was then the top of the line high-tech military carbine. So, even today it's still a formidable weapon.
I mean, one of the bullets go through Winston Churchill's top hat.
Well, it'd been nice to think it could have passed a little lower, but
the other thing that strikes me about the anarchists, when you see pictures of them, the ones associated with Sidney Street, was how flashily dressed and handsomely dressed they were in bow ties and frock coats.
Indeed,
a bit of a change from the sort of dog on a string anarchists we see today.
Yeah, Fritz Varzi died, who we can see for people who aren't on the radio. Prided himself, as did most of the anarchists, on their dress sense. And of course, being illegal activists, they found it easier to operate dressed as respectable bourgeois gentlemen. But it was the custom in those days to dress up, and they took a pride in their appearance.
A tradition we should perhaps look at re-establishing in the anarchist movement. At the time, there seemed to be a whole series of events. Previous to that, there had been the Tottenham outrage, and I think you've discovered the hitherto unknown Motherwell bank job. Will you just say a couple of words to put those in context?
Yes, in April 1908, 3 Latvians walked into the Royal Bank of Scotland in Motherwell and attempted a rather botched armed robbery of the bank, which was followed by a chase and a scuffle with police, and 2 of them were arrested. The 3rd man escaped. The 2 people who were arrested were sentenced to 10 years in prison, and one of them indeed died a year later in Peterhead prison from TB.
And was this one of the first political bank robberies?
It was the first known political armed expropriation in Britain, as far as I'm aware. But it was one of a series of failed expropriations which directed public attention to Latvian revolutionaries.
Okay, the name Peter the Painter crops up in all the accounts of Sidney Street. There seem to be endless theories about who he was. Did he in fact exist? I've heard stories that in fact he was Stalin, who was in the country a few years before. He was a Bolshevik expropriator. He was Peter Piatka. He ended up in Australia and was seen on a train in Australia by Detective Superintendent Leeson. Of the existing theories before you established your research, do you dismiss all those?
Yes. The popular theories about Peter the Painter was, first of all, that he was an agent provocateur in the pay of the Tsarist police. That stems really from 2 sources: an anti-anarchist article by Harry Quelch, the editor of the English social democratic paper Justice, and a speech made by Ramsay MacDonald in Parliament. I've examined extensively the files of the Riga police in Latvia and the Riga Okranka, the secret police, in which there are extensive reports about Peter the Painter. None of them suggest that he was in the pay of the police. Exactly the opposite. They were very desperate to apprehend and arrest him.
And he wasn't Stalin then?
He wasn't Stalin, no. This is a popular theory peddled by the policeman who was wounded at Sidney Street, Benjamin Leeson, who claimed that Stalin was the organiser of the Houndsditch robbery, and also cropped up in a series of fanciful books on intelligence subjects written by Richard Deacon, which is the pen name for Donald McCormick. Stalin is known to have visited England only once, in 1907, and in fact in 1910 he was in a Tsarist prison and was afterwards banished to Siberia, so he was actually in custody during the period. Another popular theory is that Peter the Painter later became an agent of Lenin's Cheka after the Russian Revolution. This is based on the idea that the cousin, that Peter the Painter was a man called Jacob Peters, who was the cousin of Fritz Vars, who died in Sidney Street. Peters was in London at the period. He was a Latvian Bolshevik. But after the 1917 revolution, he returned to Russia and became deputy chief of the Cheka, the Russian secret police, and in fact was the architect of the Red Terror and the man personally responsible for annihilating the Russian anarchist movement. I can say without doubt that Peters was not involved with the Houndsditch robbery, although he's popularly said in the literature on the affair to be the man that fired the fatal shots at Houndsditch. I have positive documentary proof of his non-involvement, and he wasn't present at Houndsditch, he wasn't an anarchist, and he wasn't part of the group responsible.
Okay, well, it's an effective demolition of all the existing theories about Peter the Painter. Now we come to the $64,000 question, Phil. Who was Peter the Painter?
Peter the Painter was a former Latvian social democrat called Jānis Žāklis, or Žākla, and his face first appeared on a wanted poster in London in 1911. He was said to have been the organiser of the Houndsditch robbery and to have been present at Sidney Street and escaped the siege, miraculously somehow. His name came into the case only his name came into the case only because the body of the man wounded at Houndsditch, known to the police as George Gardstein, was found in the room that Peter the Painter occupied at 59 Grove Street. The police issued his photos on a wanted poster with a bounty of £500 for his capture.
So, in trying to track down Peter the Painter, I know you've been to Latvia. How did you go about your research in Latvia?
Well, the thing that always puzzled me about the story was nobody had thought to look in Latvia for an answer to the identity of the individuals responsible. Everybody agreed that the authors of the robbery and the victims at Sidney Street were Latvian anarchists. And there's a certain amount of material in the London police files about them based on material seized from their addresses in a series of police raids. But none of the people who have written books until this time have thought to do any research in Latvia. So that's where I went in 1988, when Latvia was still part of the Soviet Union, to try and track down alternative sources of information to find out who these people were.
I think one of your first steps was you got an article in the Latvian newspapers, which...
No, that actually came later. I went to Latvia first as a tourist in 1988 and returned the next year under a business visa to do proper research. And the first tentative theory I developed, based on a number of similarities between Peter the Painter and a Latvian painter and revolutionary called Jedits Elias, was that Elias was Peter the Painter. Elias had been involved in a lot of operations during the 1905 revolution with Jānis Jāklis, and the similarities between Elias and Peter the Painter seemed too many to be coincidental. However, during my trip to Latvia in 1989, I discovered that, in fact, Elias was definitely not Peter the Painter, and that a man called Jānis Jāklis was.
I should say at this stage that Phil is holding up a photo of Jānis Jāklis, who bears an uncanny resemblance to David Beckham.
Yeah, the David Beckham photos were the mugshots of Jānis Jāklis when he was arrested in May 1904 at the age of 1901 and held in custody, charged with spreading seditious propaganda in Talsi in Latvia and Bobruisk in Belarusia. Immediately I saw those photographs, I realised that this is the same man that appeared on the wanted poster photos in London of Peter the Painter. And sure enough, in the same file, in what was then called the Museum of the Revolution and now today is the Latvian War Museum, was an original of one of the photographs on the wanted poster, on the back of which was written Jāklis in America as Thalbergs. So the police wanted poster photo was taken in 1907 in America, and Thalbergs was the maiden name of the mother of Jānis Jāklis, Margarita Thalberg.
So is that your sort of eureka moment? You thought you nailed the man?
It was. It was also the moment where all my theories collapsed and I had to start work again.
Do you believe you looked at the Czech archives in Latvia? Was that right?
Well, not the Czech archives. I did have some contact with the KGB in Riga in 1989 and even interviewed what they called a public relation officer of the KGB.
What a great job that must be.
The KGB headquarters in Riga, which is known as the Corner House, which reputedly was the highest building in Riga, because from the basement of the Corner House you could see Siberia.
Nice.
It's a Latvian joke.
Right. We'll leave that one to whittle through to our listeners.
I actually shelved this project in 1991 at around the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, and came back to the research in 2000. From 2003 to the present time, I've discovered, because of the easier access now that Latvia is independent, in the Latvian National Archives, a wealth of new material on Jānis Žāklis and the Latvian anarchists. The Latvian National Archives contains all of the original files of the Tsarist police of the period and the secret police, the Okranka, and is in fact the biggest such archive in the world outside Moscow.
And when you were looking at these archives, were people helpful? People in Latvia, I mean, was Peter the Painter big in Latvia? Had anyone heard of him?
Jānis Žāklis was a known figure in the history of the 1905 revolution in Latvia. But the history of Latvian anarchism and the career of Žāklis from the point he became an anarchist has been filleted from Latvian history of the period, because of course it was Soviet written history, and the Soviet version of the 1905 revolution tended to stress the activities of the Latvian Social Democrats and Social Democrats who subsequently became Bolsheviks and sided with the Soviet revolution. So I've had to piece together Soviet accounts that talk in passing about Žāklis with the Latvian police files on the Latvian anarchists, and piece things together.
So all this has led you to sort of place Sidney Street as just one perhaps minor episode in a much wider picture of revolutionary activity.
Yes, Sidney Street and the Tottenham outrage and the Motherwell robbery and a few other incidents really were actually footnotes to the career of Peter the Painter and the wider history of Latvian anarchism, being rare instances where expropriations went wrong, and because of that drawing public attention to the activities of Latvian anarchism. Most of the accounts of these people tend to treat the story as a matter of true crime or terrorism, but in fact what had happened was there had been a tremendous popular revolution in Latvia in 1905, which was bloodily suppressed at the end of 1905 and during the early months of 1906 by a massive wave of state terrorism, during which over 2,500 people was summarily executed, shot, hung, burnt in their homes. Over 4,500 other people died, deported to Siberia, and another 5,000 people fled abroad to Western Europe and America. At about the same period, at the end of 1905 up to the spring of 1906, a huge proportion of the main political party, revolutionary political party at the time, the Latvian Social Democracy, broke away from the party out of frustration with the party's trying to change from a policy of armed struggle against state terrorism to entering into the Russian Duma, and in fact left the party en masse and set up anarchist communist groups.
I think you said,
and these anarchist communist groups effectively formed the armed resistance against the Russian state terrorism.
I think you've seen that you placed the Latvian revolution in you talked to me before as important as the anarchist movement in Russia and in Spain. That's quite a claim.
I think it was much more significant than the anarchist movement in Russia. The Latvian revolution was a real mass movement. It began with a massacre when a peaceful demonstration was massacred by Cossacks. 73 people were shot dead, over 200 people killed. As a reaction against this, the workers' movement armed itself for protection, armed armed fighting protection. Armed fighting organisations were established in all of the factories in Riga. The workers took over Riga for a period of 3 months during the autumn. In the countryside, there was a huge armed insurrection which killed the barons, burnt down the estates, and fought pitched battles against Russian troops.
That sounds a popular revolutionary programme to me.
Jacques was one of the main figures in this movement, and in fact you could say he was the military leader of the Latvian Revolution.
One of the things I'm interested in your research in Latvia, I think you managed to track down some members of Peter the Painter's family.
Yes, in 2003 I was involved in the London Weekend television programme on the Houndsditch murders, which received a lot of publicity in Latvia, because of course this story of the activities of Latvian anarchists in Europe was completely new to the Latvian audience, and I appealed during that publicity for anybody who could supply information about Jacques or could point me in the direction of his family to get in touch. From that appeal, somebody did actually get in touch with me, and I did manage to trace some of the descendants of Jacques' family, including 2 granddaughters, one of the granddaughter of Janusz Jacques' brother, and also another woman who was the daughter of one of his the granddaughter of one of his sisters.
And how did they take the revelation they were related to a notorious anarchist?
They were rather surprised. What they knew about their relative was that he was a revolutionary. He had been an important figure in the revolution, but in 1906 had gone abroad to America, and that was the last they'd heard about him.
And what do we know of Peter the Painter? What happened to Peter the Painter later on?
Well, the last confirmed report in the police files was that he was living in Germany in 1912. But my information, which I'm still following up, is that in 1913 he emigrated to Australia, that he stayed there, and with the proceeds of expropriations in Europe actually became a successful businessman in Australia.
Oh, what a disappointment.
But that's a chapter of the book which is still under investigation.
Well, this couldn't be the same that Inspector Leeson claimed to have bumped into him on a train. That was just pure fanciful.
Account is completely fanciful.
Yeah. There's some other interesting offshoots. I think Nina Vasileva, who was one of those arrested, an associate of the participants in the Siege of Sidney Street, lived on in London to a ripe old age,
yes,
didn't she?
Vasileva was one of the defendants in the subsequent trial of people accused of being involved in Houndsditch, and she remained in the East End, living in a little room in Brick Lane, and she died in 1963.
No one ever managed to get to her to talk about it, or did she not want to, you think?
One journalist did interview her in 1961 and offered to take her to see the Jimmy Sangster's film about the Siege of Sidney Street, which was on at the cinema up the road, but understandably she declined the offer.
And did you do any research in the Met Police archives? Were they helpful, or was it just the sort of stuff in the Black Museum at Lehman Street?
No, all the original case files are in the custody of the Guildhall Library in the City of London. And the material that those case files contain are in the files of the Riga police, which I've examined in Latvia.
Right. And obviously one of the big anarchists in London at the time was Errico Malatesta, and I think attempts were made to try and associate him with the anarchists at Sidney Street. What do you think, looking at that? Now Malatesta's not going to be charged with anything, you can speak freely. Did Malatesta have any connection?
Malatesta's connection with the group was that the dead anarchist Gardstein had used his workshop in Islington to prepare the tools for the robbery. I think personally that Malatesta knew rather more than he admitted to the police, but rather wisely, he said he just knew these individuals as political refugees.
Smart move. Another interesting anarchist who was in London near the time was Serge Bonneau of the notorious Bonneau gang in France, who did similar expropriations around about the same time, and I think was acting as chauffeur maybe for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. There's no evidence of a Bonneau connection.
I hadn't come across a connection. No, Bonneau was Conan Doyle's chauffeur.
That's
until he returned to France to.
It's interesting that the Motherwell bank job was the first politicised armed robbery. I think Bonneau was the first armed robbery with a getaway car.
Yeah.
And later Mario Buda in Wall Street was the first anarchist to use a car bomb. So anarchists obviously at the cutting edge of technology. Well, I mean, where do you place? There was expropriations done by different political groups all over Europe during those years. Where do you sort of place the Latvian anarchists in the context of those?
The tactic of armed expropriation was a widely spread tactic of the period when workers' movements couldn't pass the hats in pubs and do benefit gigs. They were simply expropriating the capitalists as they saw it.
If Billy Bragg had been around at the time, they wouldn't have needed to do expropriation.
No.
The anniversary is coming up soon. Oh, so you should say something about your book. Your book is not published yet. When do you hope to finally complete it and get it out?
Well, I'd like to have the book out for the centenary of the Houndsditch murders in 2010.
And do you think that's... Are you searching for a publisher now? Is there anything our readers can help, listeners can help with?
No, I will be securing a publisher between now and then.
I imagine there's going to be an avalanche of stuff in 1911 around Sidney Street, some heritage plaques going up. I think there's a couple of buildings around Sidney Street that bear some relation to Peter the Painter.
There's a block of flats in Sidney Street called Siege House, and I believe another one called Peter's House. There used to be a pub in Sidney Street called the Artichoke that had Peter's Bar in it, displaying pictures of the Siege of Sidney Street. So it entered into London folklore, really.
Yeah, I read one account that the Guardstein gang used to walk down the middle of Whitechapel High Street all dressed like peacocks. And the reason they were asked why they walked down the middle of the high street because they said because they feared assassination by Tsarist agents, but also they used to fence, the local villains used to fence stuff for them, so there was some integration with
they had contact with the criminal fraternity because of course the Houndsditch robbery wasn't an example where things went wrong, but actually things went right more often, and they were active in England England and Scotland for at least 2 years prior to Houndsditch.
And briefly, did they have any connection with English anarchists, or was it all sort of foreign emigre anarchists?
They kept themselves very much to themselves, and really any connections they had were generally with the exiled movement.
Yeah. Okay, Phil, that's absolutely fascinating that we now know at last who Peter the Painter was. Thank you very much for that. I'm sure there'll be an avalanche of inquiries. So that concludes the first one in the Anarchism in the UK series. Next week, I'll be talking to John Retty, who was editor of Freedom in the 1960s, a well-known poet and active anarchist for over 40 years in this country, a fund of stories, and is able to take us through many episodes in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right up to the present time in English anarchism. So I hope you'd all tune back in next week to hear the second interview in the series, Anarchism in the UK.